In part 3 of our interview with Dr. Hadler, we discuss the widespread use of cholesterol-lowering drugs. Do statins reduce stroke or MI?
The story with statins is one of the great chapters, positive chapters in the history of Western medicine, from the understanding of cholesterol to its synthesis, to its biochemistry, to developing drugs called statins that interfere with its production and which are life-saving for genetic hypercholesterolemic states. The theory held that if we dropped the cholesterol, we would improve the likelihood of survival from heart disease in all of us. That was based on assessments of risk factor, although no one ever really made it clear that if you have a very high LDL cholesterol and a very low HDL cholesterol, your mortal hazard is measurable in 1% or 2%. If you have the usual definition, by the way, which is a moving target, but the usual definition of a high cholesterol, your risk is rather small, may not even be measurable in terms of months or so. So we're starting with a risk factor reduction notion where the risk is not that high. And then we have data, including the West of Scotland study, that looked at primary prevention with statins. And it turns out that in studies like the West of Scotland study, you can ask middle-aged men with high cholesterols to swallow a statin every day for 5 or even 10 years, and you won't save a life. You may save the likelihood of a heart attack, but the difference between the control and the statin group is very, very small, so that the number needed to treat to save a heart attack is well over 200, and that's a number that I think is a fatuous clinical outcome. That's why it tends not to be reproducible. I simply don't think we can measure such a rare event. In secondary prevention, the best case NNTs are around 50 to 60, which I think is the cusp for where we can measure the effect. So if you treat 50 men following their first heart attack with a statin, you may spare one a heart attack over the course of the next 5 years. You will not save a life. So statins need to be put in perspective. There's no way I'll let you check my cholesterol. I've never had any symptomatic heart disease. And I think it ought to be argued as to whether or not the notion of secondary prevention should be held up as one of the great triumphs of Western medicine.
Why are statins the biggest selling drugs in the world?
We are the most medicalized of people in the resource-advantaged world. Most people are told that they need to know their cholesterol. Most people know their cholesterol. It is considered good medical practice to measure cholesterols in perfectly well people. Bizarrely as it is, based on the science, young women know their cholesterol. Menstruating females know their cholesterol. Everybody knows their cholesterol. And if you're walking around with the notion that you have something high, and there is an agent that can make it low, it's very hard for any of us to say, please make my cholesterol lower. Very few of us are willing to ask, if you make my cholesterol lower, does it matter? If you ask that question, this would not be such a cash cow for the pharmaceutical industry. But until we ask that question, Americans will want to know what their cholesterol is, what their hemoglobin A1C is, and the like.